Having very clear defined periods in which you're eating with very clear defined periods in which you are not eating is really ideal when it comes down to weight loss. But what can you possibly eat in between those meals if you really are hungry, especially if you're on a lower carb diet? Well, we need to look at the mechanism here and why I'm suggesting not to typically snack. And I've talked about it really ad nauseum, but let's go ahead and break it down again really quick. Especially on a low carb diet, you don't want to have consistent spikes in insulin, okay? Every time you consume something, even if it's not that insulinogenic, it is slowing down the glucagon response, okay? And glucagon is responsible for all kinds of different hormonal cascades that have to do with fat loss, okay? When glucagon is elevated, it's the opposite of insulin, and it triggers hormone-sensitive lipase to start cleaving off fatty acids from glycerol. It triggers all kinds of beneficial things that have to do with fat loss and weight loss. That doesn't mean that you can't lose weight while snacking. I just sincerely believe that if you're trying to keep ketone levels higher and if you're trying to really enhance your weight loss, having these clear defined gaps in between your meals is quite important. So then we say, okay, well, I'm hungry. I can't just sit here and starve. Like I want to have a snack. I want to have something. Okay, that's okay. There's things that you can have. We just look at things that don't have a high insulin spike, and we look at things that are also lower in protein generally, because we don't even want the protein coming in, because believe it or not, protein still spikes insulin. It just does so in a different fashion. Okay, it still spikes insulin along with glucagon, so it's adjusting the insulin to glucagon ratio, which I have other videos on. I'm not going to bore you with those details right now. So let's get into the first one. The first one that I would recommend having in between meals would be actually Shirataki noodles. Okay, those are like the miracle noodles. Those are like those funny kind of clearish noodles. And what they are is a glucomannan fiber. Okay, there's practically 0 calories in them anyway. In fact, if you look on the label, it says 0 calories, but there's a couple calories. Now, glucomannan fiber, as I've talked about in other videos, it's a unique food because it draws a lot of water, okay? It's like, I can't remember what the specific number is, but it's like, 1 gram of glucomannan fiber holds like 3 or 4 grams of water, something crazy like that. So it draws in a lot of water. This is beneficial for satiety, but it has practically no metabolic impact, okay? Yes, it's a fiber, so yes, it's metabolically doing something, digestively. But as far as an insulin response is concerned, there's probably about nothing happening, okay? So we could probably still produce glucagon just fine. Now, one of the things we factor in is every time you eat, you have cholecystokinin that releases, you have all kinds of different things that still send a signal to the brain saying you just ate, okay? So the metabolism, is going to adjust accordingly. Okay, and again, this is talking about I need something, and I need something now. And you can probably find that your ketones will stay relatively high when you do consume something like that. So again, you can just eat them plain. You could put a little bit of olive oil or something on them, just a straight fat, so you're not adding more protein or not adding more any kind of potential carbs or additional fibers. Okay, even like the small amounts of carbohydrates that come from vegetables can trigger a small insulin spike that I'm trying to find foods that are going to be kind of a net zero effect for you. Okay, the next one is one that I would recommend, and that's sipping on some bone broth. Okay, bone broth, yes, there's collagen protein in it, okay, but there's no leucine. Okay, leucine is the primary protein amino acid that triggers an insulin response, okay? So when we're fasting or in between meals, typically what we want to avoid is leucine, because that's what's triggering the insulin spike. It's also what makes protein very beneficial when it comes down to muscle growth, right? That protein, that leucine, is triggering an mTOR response, okay? That's causing you to grow muscle and build muscle. But we don't necessarily want it in between meals. It's the same reason why I don't suggest drinking branched chain amino acids during a fast or in between meals. Separate topic, you've probably seen that, maybe you haven't. Okay, but at least with bone broth, you're talking about collagen protein, which is just going to be a little bit different. Sure, a small insulin spike, but practically nothing. The rest is really just sodium and some other minerals and some vitamins that are coming through. I'm a huge fan of it. I really like just how it tastes, how it satiates me. So a lot of times in between meals, if I feel like I need to eat something, I sip on some bone broth because it's such a negligible amount of calories. Beef bone broth is going to have a little bit more in the way of collagen. So if you wanted to go with like chicken bone broth, you might have a little less collagen, you might have potentially a less insulin impact there, but it's really splitting hairs. Plus, it's widely known as a good keto food. And one of the things that you could even do is if you take those Shirataki noodles that I talked about, those glucomannan fiber noodles, you could put them into a little bit of broth and essentially make like a makeshift pho. Wouldn't taste amazing like a regular pho would, but it's gonna be pretty darn close. Not quite like the rice noodles. Anyhow, I can just get myself hungry talking about it. But I put a link down below for today's video sponsor, which is Kettle and Fire. So you can check them out on Amazon, just make it easy for you. I put a link down below to their Amazon listings for their beef bone broth, but also for their chicken bone broth if you wanted to try something else. So the cool thing is they also have apple cider vinegar in it. So apple cider vinegar, I've talked about, is actually really good in between meals because it drives up AMPK, which means that it's basically triggering the energy sensor in your body to register that it's in a deficit. I mean, that's an over-exaggeration, kind of an embellishment of it, but that in essence is what AMPK is doing. And apple cider vinegar has been demonstrated to drive up that in terms of the acetic acid. So very fascinating stuff. So that link is down below. Big thank you to Kettle and Fire for the support and the sponsorship on this video. Really, really appreciate it. Appreciate you guys supporting them as well so that we can do what we do. Okay, the next one is one that people wouldn't necessarily think that you could consume, and that is going to be pork rinds. Now, pork rinds we know are a good keto food, but why do they work well in between meals? Well, because you're looking again at a negligible amount of protein, and some of the protein that's coming from it is going to be coming more in the collagen way, right? You're talking about pork skins. You're talking about pork fat and pork skins that are fried in rendered pork fat generally. Okay, so you're talking a pure like palmitic, possibly a little bit of myristic acid, maybe a tiny bit of stearic acid, saturated fat. Very minimal insulin impact there. Again, there's going to be a little bit of protein because there's some skin in there, but it's one of those foods that isn't going to trigger much of an insulin spike. Like, you might be thinking, why isn't Thomas talking about nuts? I mean, he loves macadamia nuts, he loves pili nuts, he loves Brazil nuts. I do love those things, but the fibers, the trace amount of carbohydrates, things like that, they are potentially things that can trigger a little bit more of an insulin spike. And again, I'm not saying don't eat them, okay, for crying out loud, please don't like flame me in the comments about that. I'm not saying don't eat these things. I'm not saying don't ever snack on them. I'm trying to find foods that are as close to net zero as we possibly can get. So the body almost thinks as though there's no food coming in. So it doesn't have that insulin glucagon shuffle, okay? So pork rinds are going to be a very big one there. The next one is one that people wouldn't think, and that is going to be olives, okay? Straight up olives. Small amount of fiber, okay? But also we're getting the olive oil. So get them that are going to be higher fat olives, get them that are sitting in olive oil. I was gonna say, just consume some olive oil. Like honestly, I was. But then I'm realizing like, okay, that's something that myself and maybe 9 other people on the planet would consider doing, is just drinking some olive oil. So if you actually get the olives themselves, you get not only the antioxidant effect of what's called like the hydroxytyrosol, but you're getting a little bit of the fiber that's satiating, and then you're also getting the fatty acids as well. So you can get little packets of olives. I get them at Trader Joe's. Yeah, you're talking like 70 to 120 calories. Usually not much stuff in there that's gonna trigger an insulin spike. So it's a really good one to have on hand. I usually keep them in my car if I'm going somewhere, if I feel like I'm gonna need a snack. It's also something that's really, really good if you're fasting and you feel like you absolutely just need to eat something, otherwise you're gonna go crazy. So just keep that in mind. And the last one that I wanna recommend is a really weird one, and that is gonna be mushrooms. I know you probably wouldn't snack on mushrooms typically, but try it one day. Okay, it does something where they're very, very satiating. They're satiating because of the beta glucans more than likely. Okay, so what's happening is with beta glucans, they are glucose, or like 250,000 glucose molecules bound together in a very tightly packed starch chain that we as humans do not have the enzyme to break down. But guess what? Our gut microbiome does have the ability to digest it. So we get a heavily fermentable effect that can support short chain fatty acid production, have a huge microbiome effect with practically 0 calories. Okay, there's practically nothing coming in, especially if you eat them raw. Not to mention you're getting a vitamin D benefit, but we're talking like practically no insulin spike whatsoever, something that you could have in between. Could you saute them up in some olive oil? You absolutely could. You're getting a similar benefit that you would be getting from the olives in olive oil with some mushrooms in olive oil. So it's kind of funny, like my wife will make mushrooms to put on like a pizza, or she'll saute them to put in some kind of a dish, and a lot of times there's a bunch left over, so she'll put them in a Tupperware, and then that ends up just kind of becoming my snack with a little bit of salt or something like that. Super easy and convenient. Okay, and the last one that I want to recommend, which is just kind of funny, it's not even a food. Don't be afraid to just sip on some salt water or some electrolytes. Okay, the salt itself is going to trigger a response within your brain. When we are craving salt, which could be a thing that we're having happen when we're doing keto, what happens is it goes to a region of the brain in the hindbrain, okay? And it can affect what are called NST neurons. And these NST neurons normally inhibit salt cravings, but when what happens is angiotensin 2, when we are deficient in sodium or lower in sodium, that changes the inhibitory effect of the NST neurons, meaning they are no longer stopping us from craving salt. So we start craving salt, but the mesolimbic system of our brain, the dopamine system of our brain, kind of gets those lines crossed sometimes. And even though our hindbrain, those NST neurons are shut down and we're craving salt, our mesolimbic system is crossing this and kind of making us feel like we crave anything. So sometimes just having a little bit of salt is the best thing to have in between a meal. And sometimes that's what I default to first. I feel like bone broth is a close second because the calories are so low with the salt. But anyhow, to recap, shirataki noodles, bone broth, pork rinds, mushrooms, then we have the olives, and then of course, good old salt. As always, keep it locked in here on my channel. See you tomorrow.